Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tennant.
And me, Chris Kitchener.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this week, Chris, we are once again fortunate enough to be joined by a guest. Would you like to introduce Roly Woods?
I think it's entirely appropriate that I introduce our guest, as we have enough Royal Marines who have visited us on the show. We've had people from the artillery and the general staff. So actually, it's my great pleasure to introduce Commander Roly Woods, retired, to use his proper title. By the way, Sub-Lieutenant Kitchener, retired, doesn't have the same ring. So
do you still use that as a title, though?
Unbelievably, I haven't used that title. Hang on a minute. Ever, because I don't think that'd be appropriate. And frankly, it was only narrowly that it was midshipman retired, and then you'd have to explain what midshipman was. Anyway, enough of that nonsense. We're very, very pleased to welcome Commander Roly Woods. I'll give you a quick intro and then we'll let Roly get a word in edgeways here. Roly Woods was appointed by Fighting with Pride to the important role of LGBT Armed Forces Community Memorial Officer in August 2024, having recently retired as a commander in the Royal Navy following, and given that we're staring at Roly right now, he belies that 46 years in service. Having served for over 20 years under the ban on the LGBT, and then for 24 years since it was lifted, he is, of course, very familiar with many of the issues faced by the LGBT veteran community. His recent experience as a trustee at Fighting with Pride has also given him great insight into the importance the community places on the memorial project. Going back to his time in the Royal Navy, his most recent military role was that of the Fleet Security Officer at the Maritime's Operations Centre at Northwood Headquarters, or the Hull. I never know whether you're in the Hull or on the Hull, but certainly Northwood Headquarters, from where the Royal Navy deployments worldwide are controlled. In his earlier career, he saw active service in the Falklands campaign in 1982, and after appointments in frigates and destroyers and operational deployments to the Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s, he took command of the minesweeper HMS Blackwater in 1986 as the youngest commanding officer in the Royal Navy at the time. After assignments as principal warfare officer in some of the Royal Navy's newest warships, he was appointed as the executive officer and second in command of the Queen's Frigate. In the past, is it the Queen's Frigate or the King's Frigate? I guess it was the Queen's Frigate at the time.
Depends who the monarch is, doesn't it?
It would have been the Queen's Frigate at that time, HMS Lancaster, returning to the Falklands Islands and completing a circumnavigation of South America. On promotion to commander, he joined the operational staff of the Commander-in-Chief Fleet, and from there moved to the Ministry of Defence in London, including duties such as the Defence Attaché to Tunis and Algeria, along with a stint in the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. And I love this bit about Roly as well, which I think we probably have to talk about at some point. After a few months in retirement, he rejoined Navy operations in 2012 as a full-time reservist in the Fleet Security Officer role, responsible for ship security in high-threat regions worldwide. So, Roly, welcome to Battling with Business, and thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here and looking forward to having a good chat.
Excellent. Well, I think it's after I've sort of made a bit of a meal of your career, perhaps it's much better to go back and start in your words around your career. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about sort of what took you to the Royal Navy. Perhaps you can go back to the beginning, what drew you into a life in the services, and maybe expand a bit on your early career.
Sure, yeah, delighted. So I grew up in Leicester. About as far away from the sea as you can get in the UK. Fairly traditional lifestyle, Catholic junior schooling early on, so complete with nuns and wooden rulers across the knuckles. So a bit of a foundation of discipline and structure at that stage. I wasn't a particularly sporty type. I mucked along in school sports when I had to, but I did have a passion for the outdoors. Was involved with the Cubs and Scouts from a very early age. Got involved with rock climbing, caving, hiking, camping, all that stuff, which taught me, I guess, the early sort of tenets of leadership and a bit of resilience. little anecdote. As a patrol leader in the Scouts in my early teens, we entered a county-wide scouting competition, effectively camping weekend. And my patrol of 5 of us, we came second out of all the patrols in Leicestershire. So we were very proud of that at the time. So again, early tenets of leadership, I guess. I learned what prevarication meant. It was one of the catch lines of the competition was prefabricate, don't prevaricate, which has always stayed with me, which is useful. As I got into my sixth form, getting into A levels and pre-A levels, I spent one summer in Canada on an aunt's farm in northern Nova Scotia, which was great fun, messing around on the farm, and independent traveling by myself, which was great. I then failed my Admiralty interview board the first time around, and they said, get some more life experience. So when I finished my A levels, I went back to Canada, supposedly for 6 weeks with some school chums, again, to do the same again. But then had the opportunity to stay on and work on the farm for months. So I stayed on from September through to March the following year, having a great time. So winter in Nova Scotia, proper Canadian weather, lots of ice skating and ice hockey. And I hitchhiked around a bit, got as far west as Ottawa and Ontario. But all good character building stuff, as you'd expect. So I was seeing life as it encouraged me to do so. And went back in the spring of 78, retook my AIB, my Admiralty interview board, to join, and passed with flying colours. So joined the following September after challenge, purpose. Basically, I didn't want a 9 to 5. I knew that quite early on. I wanted to serve, lead, test myself in the world. And the Navy offered that sort of purpose, challenge, and adventure from day one.
It's really interesting. I mean, obviously, I've been through a similar path, at least the first part of that, in terms of joining the Royal Navy. There's a bit that I've always wondered, where there's groups of people who sort of look at you and you say you join the military, and they look at you blankly and say, why did you do that? Mm-hmm. And I think, Roly, you've talked really well about all the kinds of things that you did naturally and you enjoyed, which almost led you there. What do you think that was? Was it growing up, family? Was it what makes people get that leadership bug almost before they know what leadership means?
That's a really good question. I think it's partially instinctive, wanting, and a number of strands, aren't there? One is instinctive, wanting to do well. I guess a degree of wanting to impress at that stage as a teenager, and do things right. Which was, again, going back to that, prefabricate, don't prevaricate. Having had that and worked out what it meant, got my buddies together, and we pre-constructed this stuff, and they were all up for it. Mostly, there was a bit of encouraging required. Of course, this is all in our own time, which wasn't always necessarily popular. But yeah, I think it's a combination of instinct, wanting to do well, and having that sort of inherent desire to sort of take charge, I guess.
It's funny. I think particularly the three of us probably had that spark and carried it through. It's almost, we need to find people who don't have that spark and to find out what the reverse is.
Well, we've had non-military people on the podcast before, but I suppose what is interesting is, out of the three of us, we all joined the naval service. I was particularly focused on joining the Royal Marines, and I think if I hadn't been successful, I probably would have not joined the Navy and joined the Army instead, because that was the sort of role I was really interested in. What is it that makes somebody want to join the Navy rather than the Air Force or the Army?
Oh, for me, that was quite straightforward. I wanted to travel, and I was going to get paid to travel and see the world. And I had some lucky breaks very early on. I got that bug going to Canada. I think I had 2 summers out there. Wasn't particularly anxious about traveling, by myself, reasonably young. But then, saw what the Navy was doing. And as I say, quite early on, got some lucky breaks. My fleet time as a midshipman, while still under training, you spend 1 term at sea. I ended up on what was then the West Indies Guard ship. So in the Caribbean for 4 months or so, island hopping from cocktail party to cocktail party. Back in the old days, it was, definitely old Navy. But, and I was seeing all these beautiful islands. We went to the States, southern Florida. That was, that sort of ticked the box very early on and remotivated, I guess. No, because I was still motivated. But yeah, for me, it was quite simple, traveling and getting paid to do it. And I had the option to go to to university, which was sort of plan B, having phoned home when I was in Canada saying I'm not coming home. Tell me what my A-level results are. And by the way, I'm cancelling Southampton for French. I'll go with the Navy if I get the opportunity.
See, I have to know, Roly gave the good answer, the answer that shows the career he's had, and I'll give you my bad answer. So there were two reasons why I joined the Navy. The first one was the Royal Navy seemed to have more aeroplanes than most people I knew, and I'd met the RAF, and no offence to many of our RAF friends and colleagues, but they seemed to be very excited about missiles and things, and that wasn't my thing. But the better reason, and I haven't been reminded this for a while, was I was at school and I was invited to meet the Royal Navy careers officer, who was, if I remember rightly, Lieutenant Commander Roger Scott, who I hope is still doing some of the things he was doing then. And it was on a Friday, I seem to remember. And I was called into the room and he said, "Oh, so you're interested in the Royal Navy?" And he talked about some interesting things. And he did mention the travel. And every now and then he started looking at his watch. And I thought, this is a bit odd. I thought, you don't seem very interested. And he said, "I'm awfully sorry, but I've got a tennis match in Gibraltar to go to. I do need to go now." And I thought, hang on a minute. We're in Hertfordshire and you're going to play a tennis match in Gibraltar. In fact, I saw him a little bit later when he came back, but I thought any organisation where they play tennis in Gibraltar, that seemed like the organisation I would want to join. So I think one of the things about the Royal Navy seems to be a dash of style in there as well, or at least that's the lie I'd like to tell myself.
Well, I think, Roly, you mentioned there sort of the old Navy, and without sort of dwelling too much on how old you are, because it's not that kind of podcast, you've clearly seen some significant transitions in the institution and probably down at the sort of tactical level as well. As we're particularly interested in this podcast about leadership and about how leadership manifests within organisations, you're probably quite well placed to talk about how organisations change over time. What's your perspective on the sort of 40 plus years of service within what is an institution and also an incredibly important part of UK defence?
Yeah, so it was certainly old school Navy when I joined in the late 70s. As I say, authority was unquestioned. Emotion was unspoken. It was the days of the gunnery officer bellowing on the parade ground, "Suck it up, buttercup," that sort of thing. And whilst I was on basic training, I lost my younger brother, my younger sibling, in a road traffic accident, which traumatized us all, including myself. And it was a tough time. So the system's response when I went back to Dartmouth after sort of 10 days or so was to put me on temazepam, which is a very strong narcotic, which just zombified me completely. So I was unable to function effectively. So I took myself off that and just cracked on. But the other solution was to give me extra responsibility as the assistant division officer for Hawk Division, so one of the houses at Dartmouth, which is effective. It kept me busy, focused the mind, gave me stuff to do, and it went quite well, to be honest. But of course, no counselling, no advice, no sessions with somebody who knew what they were talking about, other than the occasional "How you doing, bud?" As I say, old school. And then as you compare and contrast that with today, and emotional intelligence and inclusion, accountability, they're all essential to function as a leader today. And that's demonstrated at the highest levels of the services. I'm lucky enough to engage with, as I say, the senior levels, the highest levels of defence over the last couple of years, since I've been working with the charity Fighting with Pride. And the understanding at that level is unmistakable. They get the business case for inclusion and empathy, and that's slows down the system. There's no question. Well, I was going to go on to just mention. I was going to mention it later, but as we're there talking about younger officers and the reflection of that sort of system, if you like. In my last role in the Maritime Ops Centre in Navy Ops, my deputy there was always a junior Royal Marines officer, so a captain Royal Marines. And over that period of 12 years, I had about 7 or 8 junior officers come through that role, and they were all without doubt outstanding. And I don't use that term lightly. from the point of view. Their technical description was as my assistant, but they were undoubtedly my deputy. They would represent me at 1 and 2 and 3-star briefings, and were just supremely competent and confident, which obviously is a huge justification of the training they're going through. And whilst I acknowledge they're elite forces, yes, I'm not just saying that to pander to our Royal Marine, but they were certainly above average. And to be fair, that was reflected by all the Royal Marines in the mock. And of course, we ended up with a 2-star Royal Marine as the commander operations, well before we got a 4-star running the Navy Royal Marines. So yeah, just a reflection on the changes and how that's reflected right through the structures down to sort of junior officer level.
I'm going to put aside that this is a Royal Navy episode rather than us congratulating the Royal Marines. Roly, we've talked about this, but going back to your point, we've been very lucky. Quite recently, we were at RAF's Crown World, the Tedder Institute, and one of the things we talked about is this sort of constant change and growth and evolution of the services, and I think that's even true when we talk to the Army as well. It feels like you have been able to observe those changes, and I'm interested in what your experience of that was, because in almost every organization I've been in, this kind of cultural change, and it feels like it's a cultural change, seems glacial and almost seems imperceptible. Did you see did it happen slowly and incrementally, or were there jumps? How did the Navy go from what is effectively Cold War Navy into the modern Navy that we see perhaps today?
Yeah, well, of course, I see it through a specific prism, which is the LGBT prism. So I lived under that ban for 22 years. And let's just talk about that briefly, because it was a huge challenge. So you're living a double life. You're in constant fear of discovery. You're looking over your shoulder the whole time. Because I could have been sent to prison. The UK military was sending officers to civilian prison in the mid 1990s for being gay, because they couldn't go to military detention courses with other ranks. So that was the level we were talking about. Hence the concern, the worry, living a double life, and that impacted me as a person, let alone as a naval officer. You were living secrecy in secrecy the whole time. Emotional isolation. I was described by one partner as super secretive, and of course they understood the rationale behind it, but it's never easy. I felt I needed to overperform, if you like, to stay invisible, protect my career, and it took a toll. And we won't go down the rabbit hole of imposter syndrome, but certainly early in my career, it was a thing. And I recognize that now in hindsight. And that's one of my regular lines of advice to people is, yeah, you are good enough. You can do it, because, yeah, it's a real thing. Anyway, so we got to the lifting of the ban, which came about because of a legal direction from the European Court. It wasn't through the goodness of the government's heart. And right up until the late 90s, you had the likes of Ian Duncan Smith and Nicholas Soames in Parliament bemoaning the fact and how it would be the end of the military. It would be terrible for operational effectiveness and operational cohesion. All those tropes, which were completely ridiculous. And of course, then there was the security challenge. You were supposed to be a risk to security because you could be blackmailed by hostile intelligence services. But of course, you could only be blackmailed because they said it was wrong to be gay. So the European Court ruled in our favour. Eventually, it took a long time, many years of battling through the UK courts, then to the European Court. So that was September 99. In January 2000, Jeff Hoon stood up in Parliament and said the ban was going to be lifted. And I say that wasn't through the goodness of his heart or because people supported it in general. He said something along the lines of, we cannot pick and choose the decisions we implement. The status quo is simply not an option. So for all the whole LGBT cohort in the military serving, that was not a welcoming embrace into the armed forces when the ban was lifted. So it took a while, and then it took a further 5 or 6 years before the culture started to change. To be fair, the dark blue, the Navy had some seniors in place who got it. So Alan West, Admiral West was Spithead, as he now is. Jonathan Band, they got it. And they were instrumental in a fundamental shift. And for me, it was the watershed moment was London Pride 2006, when the Navy marched in uniform for the first time with the Army and the RAF in matching polo shirts because their chiefs of staff would not endorse it. They didn't want to take the risk. Delighted to say that the Navy did. And that was a world's first for military to be marching in uniform in a sort of organised Pride march. And that was, as I say, watershed for me and for all of us that were on it. And even now, just talking about it, I get goosebumps on the back of my neck as I remember turning the corner onto Oxford Street with 1 million people on the streets of London, and then cheering us to the rooftops or beyond, as soon as they realised we weren't a fancy dress group. And yeah, for me, that was transformational. And the youngsters on the way back on the bus were just it was expressions like, for the first time, I feel part of the organisation properly, because they've been allowed to take part and be recognised as such. And then we've gone from strength to strength since then, and we now get chiefs of staff at the pre-march briefings and stuff like that. So that was a step change. So to go back to your question, we went from, through my prism anyway, dark right up until 2000, and then reluctantly and gradually over for 5 or 6 years, there was that significant change. And then from then, it's gone from strength to strength. And as you probably know, the armed forces in general have been in the Stonewall top 100 workplace equality index as inclusive employers for many years now, because we do it properly. It's always like the military. You tell them to do something, they get on and do it well, even if the politicians were a bit reluctant. So we've now got great networks. We've now got sort of fully inclusive policies. You've got allies, you've got mentors, you've got great leaders, great examples. So, yeah, it was quite a big step, if you like, with that change of the law, although it took a while for it to be for the culture to change around it.
So many questions, and this is the first time I've spoken to someone like this from the LGBT community. First thing that I want to say is, as you were talking about it, it actually made me extraordinarily proud to be a veteran of the Royal Navy, because that's the kind of behaviour I think you would expect from the Royal Navy. And so that makes me very happy to sort of, albeit being dragged into the 21st century going that way. But there's a couple of points that I'd like to make and some questions as well. So the first point is, if we step back from this particular issue, I think it's really interesting because it talks about a change in an organization, a significant cultural change. And I know many older people who were the people like Nicholas Soames and others saying, well, we have nothing against members of that community, but we're going to try and attempt to prove that something terrible would happen in the military. And I look back now, and actually, I can't remember the last time anyone has said that members of that community shouldn't be in the military. Now, don't get me wrong, that's been superseded by trans, perhaps. In fact, I think women have received that mantle of people who shouldn't be in the military. But how interesting that something that a significant majority of people said was terrible, literally, this would shake the foundations of an organization. And in a blink of an eye, if you look at the history of the Royal Navy, all of a sudden nobody even blinks about that now. In fact, quite the opposite. There's a sense of pride in terms of how we treat members of that community. So that struck me as really interesting. And I definitely don't want to underplay the pain and that people like yourself suffered, and people before then, before the ban was raised. But I think we often sort of think there are these things that can never change, but it does take people to step forward and say, whether it's the European Court, but then senior leaders in an organisation to say, we will change. And all of a sudden, not that many years later, and everyone almost has forgotten what the kerfuffle was about.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting sort of aspect of the things that are parts of your tradition and your heritage that are important and the things that are not important, and understanding what you need to change to progress and develop, and what is, fundamental to what you are as an organization and your culture. And I think that point about the fact that it was so...
How's the business going?
We're busier than ever, but struggling to get the staff we need.
Recruiting can be such a distraction. We gave Job Centre Plus a try, and they've really helped us out.
Really?
Yeah, it was dead easy. We got our own employer advisor, Julie, who helped advertise our jobs, shortlisted candidates for us, and let us interview at the Job Centre. We've hired some great people, and Job Centre Plus really took the hassle out of it, and there was no fee.
Brilliant. That's straight on my to-do list.
Find out more at business.gov.uk/recruit. Eligibility criteria apply.
Push back on that it had to be a legal mandate from the European Court. But as you say, Chris, the moment that came into force, the Navy adapted very, very quickly. My only sort of experience of this, I suppose, is within the Royal Marines. During my service was the conversation about women fighting in frontline roles. And I'm very proud to say that I've never saw any reason why that wouldn't be a sensible thing to do. Of course, with all of these things, we need to make sure that we're doing things for the right reasons and do all of the right checks and balances to make sure that we are ready for it. But I've never seen any problem with it. But it's really interesting. In the last few months, we've, created a storm in a teacup about growing beards. So I think part of this is just about the institutions not being willing to change rather than the fundamentals of what it is we're discussing. I think after the break, Roly, if you don't mind, I'd like to explore how the Navy changed and why it's in a better place. But before we get to that, I'd like to just go back to the point where pre-ban, you were talking about having to live a double life. And I know from my service that life in the military is all encompassing. It's not just a job, it is a way of life. And I had to get up every day and motivate myself to go and do sometimes quite difficult things, and more importantly, get other people to do quite difficult things. And I think I would have found that incredibly difficult if a large part of that organisation had or criminalised who I was as a person. So how did you find the balance of being loyal to the naval service and believing in the cause, and yet having to live that double life?
Yeah, you touched on a really interesting point, actually. So my balance, if you like, was not living in a naval port. I made my hometown in Exeter, far enough away from Plymouth, which is where my first few ships were based, that I could have privacy. And I had a partner, and we lived together, and we had effectively a healthy, well, as healthy as it could be under the constraints, relationship. But there were always limitations. So when my Navy friends came to visit, I had a straight run ashore around the straight pubs of Exeter. And when I was out with my gay friends, we did the gay circuit. I just had to hope that the two never met when they were in town. But that was my lifestyle. And the first time I ever went to a gay bar in my life, it was in Exeter, miles away from anywhere. But I walked around the block. I was doing what I thought were clever counterintelligence checks, looking in shop windows to see if I was being followed. It sounds crazy, sounds paranoid, but that was for real. And I was doing that whenever I went out. So, yeah, that was the challenge. But then I had a partner, and we were able to have a reasonably balanced life when I was at home. But there's no question of what took priority. And yeah, another example, I came home from a 8-month deployment in the Gulf. And you know what it's like when a ship comes home from deployment, family and friends on the jetty, lots of emotion, lots of hugs and kisses. And there's my mum with a female friend and their baby, And my partner came along with them under the guise of the female friend with the baby sort of thing. But we couldn't do the whole emotional great to see you after 9 months type thing. It was, shaking of hands and you're missing out on that unique naval experience of that huge upwelling. And I was just, completely challenged between loyalty to my partner and love for my partner and loyalty to the service and brackets not getting discovered.
Yeah, it's incredible to think that this was only late 90s.
It is, and this must be interesting when you talk to people like myself who don't have this experience. Actually, there's two emotions that I feel, and I think we've done this before with other things. The first one is it breaks my heart. For me to join the British military, to be an officer in the Royal Navy, stood for something, and it meant I was joining to protect other people. And so the fact that you were having to live a double life in order to play that role seems, it just breaks my heart. That's not what this is supposed to be about. It is supposed to be us being in the military to protect everyone, not to protect certain groups, but to protect everyone. So there's I feel a very emotional response to that, which is that is a great shame, and it's a shame that it happened, and shame that we allowed it to happen for so long. But there's another thing, and I don't know how you feel about this, Roly, which is we often talk about doing the right thing, which is a moral thing, and then there's an effectiveness thing. So, okay, let's say I actually don't care about the LGBT community. Let's say that actually I have no affinity either way. Okay, I am a ruthless person, and I want my Royal Navy to be the most effective Royal Navy it can be. So come time of war, my people will be the most effective fighting people they can be. For that to be true, I need to make sure that my executive officer, my commanding officer, my junior officer, the men, and now the women, don't have to worry about living a bloody double life, because otherwise they will get in trouble. So for me, it's this sort of bifurcated nature of, not only is it the right thing to support this community, and you use the word inclusion, which I think is important, but it's also the effective thing. You talked about the sort of the facade you potentially put on, that you had to sort of switch into this mode as a ruthless bastard. What a waste. Actually, I'd have much rather you not have to worry about that, and the Royal Navy probably would have got another 5% out of you almost.
Exactly that. No, absolutely. And it's tried and tested. I mean, there's all that, dare I say, bullshit about, it's have a negative impact on operational effectiveness. And it's proved teams who can be themselves, who can bring their true selves to work, are better. There's no question. I'll give you another anecdote, actually. HMS Lancaster, mid-90s. I was the executive officer, second in command. So command qualified, working for a really great commanding officer, Commander Nick Holland, who won't mind me mentioning his name. And out of the blue, one Saturday afternoon at sea, he broadcast over the ship's broadcast for me to go to his cabin. And there and then, on that spot, he said, "Roly, are you gay? There are stories circulating about you in the wardroom, the officers' mess." And in that instant, I had to decide, do I lie to somebody I have the utmost respect for, who I have a fantastic working relationship with, and with whom I built this great ship's company to save my career? Or do I put my hand up and say, "Yeah, you got me, I'm gay," and be flown off the same day and never go to sea again? And that was, talk about a moral dilemma. And I struggled with it for years until I got to see him. I lied, clearly. Got away with it. I hate to use that expression. So I lied to him. I then had to lie to all the officers because they'd been talking about me because they'd seen me with somebody. And that haunted me for years until I took him out for lunch many years later. He'd retired as a Commodore. And we stayed in touch, and we sat down, and I explained it all to him. He knew by then anyway, because of some various media stuff, but he took me at face value at the time, and accepted my story. But that was a huge challenge. And what I would say, again, this is sort of not a great sequitur, but we need to keep all this in the context of those who were much more harshly treated and had a much harder time than me. And we can come on to that when we talk about fighting with pride, perhaps. But there are some absolutely appalling stories, experiences. We'll come back to this.
Well, look, let's take a quick break. I think that actually is a good segue to talk about Fighting with Pride, your role in that. And I might sneak in a few more leadership Royal Navy questions in there as well. So let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. First half of the episode today, Roly was very kind in talking a bit about his early life in the Royal Navy, also about his experiences being a gay man in the Royal Navy, both before and after the ban was lifted. But right now, you're a trustee with Fighting with Pride, and I'll be honest, I'm not that familiar with Fighting with Pride. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about it, your role, and some of the things that you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. So the ban on being gay in the military was lifted in the year 2000. And in 2020, a very good friend of mine, Craig Jones, who incidentally had been instrumental in holding senior officers' feet to the fire in the early 2000s to get policies changed and terms and conditions improved for LGBT community. Anyway, in 2020, to mark the 20th anniversary of the lifting the ban, Craig corralled a small cohort to write about their experiences of serving under the ban. And the book was called Fighting with Pride. 10 of us wrote a chapter each about our experiences, and we published it. And we did a panel at Roosie with Admiral Lord West chairing the panel, which got good coverage. But during the evolution of the book, it became very apparent there was a huge cohort of veterans who had just been completely abandoned by everybody, not just the state, by the military. And they'd led blighted lives from the day they were dismissed. And these are the veterans who were dismissed or forced to resign or chose to resign because they couldn't handle it anymore. So Fighting with Pride was born from the book. From then, and Craig was the CEO quite early on, and the other joint CEO was Caroline Page, RAF veteran, the first trans serving officer who transitioned while serving, actually. Amazing pilot and an incredible person as well. So the book was published, the charity was stood up, and quite quickly, Craig corralled funds and grants from various organisations to start with, to get some formal research carried out by Northumbria University to quantify the treatment that had happened to veterans. From that, he was able to get into before the all-party parliamentary group for defence and to brief them on this cohort of people who had been abandoned. Let me just give you a couple of anecdotes of tales that I'm familiar with from people that involved, the veterans who were affected. A 19-year-old medic under training, just about to qualify as a radiographer, was outed, investigated. When I say investigated, I mean they're interrogated. When I say interrogated, I mean interrogated for hours on end, days on end, by Cold War trained interrogators, trained to interrogate Russian spies, as it were. No legal representation, very little support. And if they were lucky, they were dismissed. If they weren't lucky, they went to detention quarters for several months and then thrown out. They will be subjected to intrusive medical examinations. I'll leave it to your imagination when I say intrusive, but I mean intrusive. They were outed to their family and friends. They had their belongings gone through, personal letters and diaries and everything gone through. And then if they were being dismissed, marched to the main gate. And the example I'm talking about was marched to the main gate of HMS Nelson in Portsmouth and thrown out. He couldn't go home because he'd been outed and his family disowned him. This 19-year-old slept rough in the park outside HMS Nelson for 3 nights. He had no idea what to do. And this is historic. It's not the 90s, but it was happening right up until the laws had changed. There were women who were sexually abused by their investigators. There are, as I say, officers who were sent to jail in the mid-90s. So this is the cohort who lost their pensions, lost their pay, lost their families, and were broken people. And if you had a criminal record, you couldn't get a job. So when I say their lives are blighted, that's sort of a fairly light description.
Mm.
So yeah,
yeah, I mean, it's harrowing to hear these stories, and as Chris said earlier, it's actually quite upsetting to think that I was part of a service that had this history behind it. But I'm particularly interested in the culture that creates the conditions that exacerbates these and keeps these rules going, even when the evidence.
They almost seem vindictive. I mean,
Yeah.
Roly, the way you've talked about it, this wasn't simply, you've been caught doing a thing we don't like. There'll be a small administrative process, and then you'll be sort of gently escorted off the premises, which many things would sort of lead to. It really feels sort of slightly vindictive about it. I mean, that I don't know.
Yeah.
Dare I say, it wasn't slightly vindictive. There were elements of the SIB and the Royal Military Police who took great pleasure in what they were doing. And yeah, they could have done a simple administrative interview. You've broken the rules, you're out. These, as I say, these are interrogations. They wanted networks, they wanted friends, and there's no doubt that some of clearly not every investigator was, but there was a significant cohort who were maliciously implementing and invoking. And coming to your point, don't forget, we recruit from society. So we reflect society. And this is the era, part of this era was the 80s. You had HIV/AIDS taking over. So we were, the community was tarnished with that brush. And society in general was not, in the 70s and 80s certainly, was by no means supportive. It was on the cusp of changing in the 80s and 90s. But HIV and AIDS slowed that down, and the stigma was still phenomenal. So I think, to go to your point of why it was like that, to my mind, we were reflecting society, but then magnified because of the military angles, if you like.
Yeah, and I'm under no doubt there was probably some very homophobic people who were probably deliberately put into those roles because the system probably thought that was more effective. I think the wider question I have though is, deep homophobia is not, or perhaps it was, I don't know, widespread. I think the vindictiveness that you sort of describe and the harrowing stories are really quite disturbing. And my question, I suppose, is, do you think that was just a reflection of society at the time, or do you think the service institution was creating conditions where people thought that they were doing the right thing, and that this was not a few bad eggs, this was good people who thought they were carrying out their duties and not really questioning the wider consequences?
Yeah, I think that's a key part. I was going to come on to the element of basic training. So from day one, as an officer, when you're being trained to be a duty officer, there are confidential DCIs, Defence Council instructions, that you are briefed on how to respond when you're the duty officer and homosexual activity is detected. And it goes through chapter and verse of what you should do, what investigation should be put in place, and what medical examination should take place. And it's instilled from day one that is your duty. So that's from the activity perspective. And then, of course, as I touched on earlier, there's this security angle where it was drilled in all the time so that you were blackmailable if you were gay, and therefore you were susceptible to coercion. Therefore, you were a security risk, and that was black and white. And for all of my direct vetting interviews, or positive vetting interviews as they were then, a key element of that interview was, are you gay? Have you got any homosexual friends? Have you ever indulged in homosexual activity, all that sort of stuff? So it was institutionalized. It was the system. And I'm sure there were those that thought they were doing the right thing. because they were following the rules. But yeah, I was ordered to do it isn't always a defence, isn't it?
It feels like there's a fear of change as well.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't put my finger on it, but that seems like an exaggerated response to something, which now looking back seems like an entirely unnecessary. Whether the rule was right or wrong, seems an unnecessary way to.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're 25 years on from the ban being overturned, and you're clearly part of an organisation that is not only continuing to drive that change, but supporting those people that were vindictively treated under the ban. But you talked earlier about the fact that the military, and I think particularly the Navy, makes the Stonewall top 100 list of employers. And my service in the Royal Marines and the wider naval service, certainly, there were isolated incidents of homophobia, but generally as an organisation, I felt that it was a very diverse and welcoming organisation. How did the Navy get from being in that really dark place it was in the late 90s to very, very quickly and very successfully changing that culture?
Leadership at the top, I think I mentioned before. So, as I say, it wasn't immediate. It took 5 or 6 years before the terms and conditions of service were balanced, such that gay couples could get their marriage quarter, for example, and travel warrants and all the admin and nif-naf and trivia that you take for granted, which had never been applied to partners. Same-sex partners were made available. But as I say, the likes of Alan West, Jonathan Band, directing from the top of the service, effectively. Diversity desks were established. There's a whole raft of legislation associated with diversity. And early on, so about from 2006, 2007, I started, and then others took it up, establishing single service network. So the Navy LGBT Forum network, depending on what it's called today, which was, again, a huge step in giving a voice and a presence to the LGBT serving community. And but RAF, Army all have their own networks, and they've gone from strength to strength and are great organisations and are doing a lot. As I say, they've evolved to a very, very effective organisations today. And this year they've put a lot on from the historical perspective to support Fighting with Pride in its work for veterans. So 2 ends really, down the grassroots level, providing a network for the community, having diversity desks to drive the policy and inform the chain of command where policy needs to go, and then seniors who get the business case that teams are better when they can bring their true selves to work, as we said earlier.
Do you think also the fact that overnight people started to come out and the Navy didn't grind to a halt and operational effectiveness suddenly didn't dip, that the whole bogeyman idea of gay people serving will have a detrimental effect on operational effectiveness, it was just clearly not true? And do you think that sort of changed people's attitudes?
It will have helped, yeah. I mean, let's face it, we've always been there. There have always been homosexuals in the military, and they've always been operationally effective. So it was, as I say, it's a specious argument in the first place. But yeah, there's no question that as people came out, it became the norm. And yeah, on the whole, people were accepting. I'm sure there were homophobes who hated it, but officers' messes, and I relate to the officers' mess because that's my experience, were supportive. And going back to Craig Jones, and he came out to his commanding officer as he handed over the Deltec signal to his captain, saying, which was the direction to lift the ban. And he took his husband to the Burns night mess dinner 3 or 4 nights later, much to everybody's consternation initially. But of course, the world didn't stop, and they had a great time, and they were wearing kilts anyway. So it wasn't. There were questions about, will he wear a dress? I mean, yeah. So yeah, you couldn't make it up. To be fair, that's what my father asked my mother when he found out I was gay, but that's another question, another issue. So yeah, I mean, I know of course society was evolving as well at the same time. So by the 2000s, we were well behind the curve compared to society.
There are clearly other groups that are going through this kind of challenge in terms of their position, whether it be in society or the military. Obviously, at the moment, I think the US seems to be sort of degrading a little bit in terms of its approach to the military. But irrespective of that, if there is a group of people that want to bring cultural change, whether it be a very personal lifestyle acceptance or simply they want to change the culture in some way, you've been through it. You are part of an organization that wants to commemorate and sort of represent this. What's your advice to people that want to bring that kind of cultural change?
That's a huge question. You need senior buy-in. If you're going to change the culture, then the leadership has got to lead it. And I'm going to be specific here on the trans issue because it's a subject close to my heart. Some great trans friends, and when you know what they've been through and what they have to put themselves through to be their true selves, they are some of the bravest people I know. And sadly, I think there's a perception that the trans issue is a separate one to the wider inclusivity inclusion issue. So while we've got LGB, I would say well sorted, but sort of making strong progress, the T element is a challenge. And I look across to America, and what they're doing is just absolutely appalling. It's not slight changes. I mean, they're rewriting history. They're dismissing the senior trans officer in the US Army is just about to be a full colonel who's breathtakingly capable. They did a Google search to delete inclusion and gay from UK military history, and it took out everything, including the Enola Gay aircraft. I mean, it just beggars belief. And we're very much alive to changes over here from that perspective. There's no indication of it, certainly on the LGBT side. But you look at what's the trans argument in the UK, which is certainly not going away. And some of the actions that are being taken are, to my view, going in the wrong direction. But that's probably another discussion.
I mean, I wonder whether this, and again, I have to sort of be very careful as a straight white man who probably doesn't have the same experience, but it feels an awful lot like people are scared of things. They don't understand something. So to your point about LGB broadly being accepted and understood, why would trans be any different? And yet it seems to be this new 30 years ago, being gay was this thing that you would question and you would whisper about the terrible things they would do. Well, that's changed. Yeah, but trans are now somehow.
But that's different.
Exactly. That, in fact, there's the phrase, but that's different.
Yeah.
I think it's about fear and understanding as well. But perhaps there's a point as well about these things are never settled. I mean, the whole point about fighting with pride is about the fact this isn't necessarily an entirely settled thing that means you don't need to represent this issue. The fact is, in America, they've sort of gone backwards in this. And I think your implication, Roly, we could do the same thing. There are political futures where this could happen again. So maybe the point is you have to keep the drumbeat going.
Let me just jump in on that because I've got a great example of how you just hit the nail firmly on the head. There's just been Fighting with Pride veterans have just been involved with an LCVP, a landing craft vehicle and personnel in Portsmouth, which was part of the Falkland Islands Task Force. It was operated from Fearless. And to mark the 25th anniversary of the lifting of the ban, it's had a rainbow livery from Mission Motorsport on both sides. So it's got a rainbow stripe down either side. We've made quite a good story out of it. It's hit the media. It hit the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail. and within 24 hours, there were 2,000 effectively hate messages on their online versions. I've got examples of them. I won't read them out, but I mean, we thought we'd left that behind in the 90s. And that is where society has gone, sadly. And that's following on from empowerment of that cohort. But kind of surprising to me that we reverted so quickly. So were people just masking their feelings before, or are they being, re-radicalized, to use a strong term, I know, but which is really negative. So you're absolutely right. There is a reason for it, and that's part of our media to counter that, because they were on DB News, and a certain retired Rear Admiral was pontificating about it, which was very upsetting. But there are two positives about that. One is we can really justify why pride is required, because we need to avoid going backwards, like you were just saying. And also, the media was of sufficiently high profile that we actually found new veterans who didn't know about Fighting with Pride or about the financial recognition scheme, which we're very keen to highlight to get people to apply for.
Well, I mean, sorry, you're getting me riled up now. So the Telegraph and the Mail believed there were no gay military people fighting in the Falklands War. Apparently, it's that kind of disconnection which it really frustrates me. They're the first people to say we love our military, and then quietly the bit that's not spoken is, but not that bit of our military. But I guess that's the challenge, and it comes back to, and this is something I think we all believe in, is it is about the leadership. The leadership starts at the top in terms of, as you've said, setting the conditions. It is the leadership. It's the Prime Minister and the cabinet and the chiefs of staff and all the people going down. They are the ones that will dictate what is acceptable and not acceptable behaviour, and so that leadership is important.
Indeed, yeah. Could I just come back? I did want to just finish a little bit more about Fighting with Pride, because I was explaining how we identified the cohort, got the research done, then persuaded the government to set up an independent review, which is where Lord Etherton came in. He did a complete review looking at calling for evidence from veterans who provided their harrowing stories in their hundreds. Came out with 49 recommendations, many of which have now been implemented, which is the reparations, the restoration of medals. Oh, a little point I didn't mention. When people were court-martialed for being gay, their medals were ceremonially ripped off their uniform for ritual humiliation. Yeah, anyway, medals are now being returned. Yeah, quite. So medals are being returned, berets are being returned. We're doing welcoming back to the military family, which is a huge thing for the veterans. They just want to be back as part of the community, because it's what it is. I was out, we had a week in Snowdonia with a bunch of veterans, and none of them had met before. They hadn't done anything like this in decades. And within a couple of hours, the banter was there, and their eyes were lighting up because they had this sort of community again, which they hadn't had for decades. So the recommendations are being implemented, and that's where I come in as the memorial officer at Fighting with Pride. We're establishing a national LGBT Armed Forces Community Memorial at the National Memorial Arboretum, which are in the construction phase. We had a design competition last year. We've got a great design which represents an opened letter in bronze, a couple of meters tall, of words from a letter that was used in evidence against somebody at court-martial, and that's due for dedication in the autumn of this year. So that's one of the final reparation measures from the Etherton report.
I think just before we sort of close off and wrap this up for today, I'd just like to say thank you for everything you've done and continue to do, because I think it's so important that, as Chris has said, we keep the conversation going. And I've, just in the last hour of talking to you, I've learned so much about a subject that I thought we'd put to bed that clearly we haven't. And I think it's really important that we keep that conversation going and we keep those progressive changes. As Chris said, both for the moral reasons, it is just good leadership, but also for the efficiency of the organisation. So thank you. If people are listening and have a story to tell or were affected by the ban, either because they were gay in the military or had family members, how can they get in touch with Fighting with Pride, and what can they do?
Really glad you asked that. So the website is quite simple, fightingwithpride.org.uk, all kinds of contacts on there. What is supremely important at the moment is the government has finally put cash on the table. It's not compensation. It will never be compensation. There are those that view it as a pittance, but the 75 million in the pot for veterans who are dismissed and those who are impacted. If you were dismissed, you can get it 50k, and if you were impacted, forced to resign, there is a sliding scale of up to 20k. So we're really trying hard to make sure as many people as possible know about that, and there's all the detail that they need to find out more through the Fighting with Pride website.
Amazing. Thank you. And we'll make sure that we push out a link with all of the socials that we push out for this episode. So, Roly, just finally to say thank you for giving up your time and talking to us here on Battling with Business.
Well, I'm hoping we might even be able to persuade Roly to come back on, because I want to talk to him as well about his. Well, see, look at this. I do this at the very end about your long and illustrious career in the Royal Navy, because there are lessons around being junior officer, becoming a more senior officer, and that's fascinating as well in terms of that transition. Yeah, but not for this episode. I think we've come to a conclusion on this. But I also want to firstly echo what Gareth has said, but also talk about this podcast is all around leadership. And I think it is critical that anyone listening to this who thinks, well, this is a story about something that happened in the past to other people and we have changed now, I now want you to think about something that happens in your organization, something, whether it's mental health, whether it's something I don't even know about. It takes leadership both to stand up, to create change, to support people, to have empathy. And just before anyone thinks we're a bunch of bleeding heart liberals, which actually we are probably, but again, I want to really, really ram home this idea. Sometimes it is about doing the right thing. In fact, it should be about doing the right thing, because that's what we as leaders should be standing for. But it is also about the effectiveness thing. This is that I'm actually almost looking forward to someone saying, well, you're just, it's all bleeding heart. And I'll say, no, it's because I want to create high performing teams that will beat everyone else. And so it is the moral thing to do and is the effective thing to do. And I think that's what too many people forget.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll get off my high horse about that.
No, absolutely right. Couldn't agree more.
Brilliant. Well, for our listeners that feel we haven't quite scratched the itch, we did an episode quite early on the power of diversity, where we looked less at particular minority groups and more just at the value of diversity in organisations. So well worth checking out. If you have strong feelings about what we've talked about today, then we'd love to hear your questions or get your views. You can reach out to us on Blue Sky or X, formerly Twitter, at battlingwithbiz with a Z, or you can email us direct at battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. If you've enjoyed what you've heard and this is a new podcast to you, then please do subscribe, and then you'll get a new podcast weekly talking about all things business, leadership, culture and teams, dropping into your inbox every Thursday. But for now, thanks again, Roly, for your time, and we look forward to coming back into your inbox next Thursday. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.